In this video, I'm going to be talking about global illumination in animations. So I've rendered a short sequence, which I'm playing now in Hero. And you can see if you look on the walls, that there's these very unpleasant swimming blotches appearing. And as I'm sure you realize, these are a product of the irradiance cache. Anyone who's ever used irradiance caching will be familiar with this blotchy effect. But it's not just the blotches themselves that are the problem, but it's also the way that they're swimming on the surface of the box. And this is one of the main drawbacks of using irradiance caching in animations, the way that the blotches will swim over surfaces. It just looks very unnatural. Now, the reason that we get these largish blotches with irradiance caching is that in order to speed up render times, it will sample a fairly large area of a surface and then merge the samples together. So instead of getting very fine grain like we would do with Monte Carlo, where each individual pixel is sampled, with irradiance caching we get these larger blotches, and the problem with them is they look quite unnatural. Now if I return to my scene in Modo, we can have a look at the global illumination settings. And you can see that my irradiance rays are already set to 4K, my irradiance rate is 1 pixel, and my irradiance ratio is set to 6, so in terms of quality the settings are already pretty high. Now I could set the number of rays to 8K, but I know from experience this isn't going to solve my problem. So what I'm going to do now is to use Monte Carlo in combination with irradiance caching. So I'm going to use a new hybrid rendering in Modo 801, which means that the first bounce is going to be calculated as Monte Carlo and the second bounce is going to be calculated as irradiance caching. So I'm going to set the use IC setting to second bounce only. And I'm going to increase the number of indirect illumination rays, which controls how many Monte Carlo rays are going to be fired. So this means that essentially the first bounce is going to be Monte Carlo, which is going to give me some good accuracy, probably going to be quite noisy. The second bounce is going to be calculated much faster because it will be using irradiance caching. Now with irradiance caching relegated to the second bounce, I'm hoping that the blotchy artifacts will be much less visible. So I'm going to fire a test render and I'll just pause the video while it's rendering. And here is the test render, and you can see that although the blotching is more or less gone as far as I can tell, it's very, very noisy. Now if I compare it to the previous render where I rendered the sequence, you can see that the average frame time was around sort of 48 seconds, and this is rendered in 49 seconds. So it's not much slower, but obviously I need to do something about the noise. So I'm going to return to the scene, and I'm going to increase the number of Monte Carlo rays to 2048. And while I'm here, I'm also going to reduce the number of irradiance rays to 1024. Now there's a setting here that you need to be aware of when you're using irradiance caching as a second bounce. I recommend you go into the channels and you look for the secondary rays channel and just increase that to 100%, because what happens here is that on the second bounce, when your secondary rays are set to the default value of 25%, you'll only be using a quarter of the rays that are set here. So I think when you're using the hybrid rendering, it makes more sense to actually just set it to 100% and then to control the rays directly here. So with these settings changed, I'm going to fire another test render. And here is the completed render, and you can see it's still very noisy. Not quite as noisy as the previous one, but still very noisy nonetheless. Now I could return to the scene and increase the Monte Carlo rays to 8192, for example, keep pushing the settings, but at this point my render times are going to be going out of control. It's already doubled since the last render. The last render was at 49 seconds and now we're at 2 minutes and 14 seconds. If I quadruple the amount of GI rays, we're likely to see the render times quadruple as well. And now we'll be looking at 8 minutes a frame for this very simple scene, and my sequence will just take a very long time to render. And the reason that I'm getting all this noise in this scene is that this is a very, very hard situation for global illumination to deal with. The reason for this is that all the light is being provided by these three small spheres, and the smaller the light source, the harder it is for GI to give you clean results. And there's a reason for this. If you can imagine that every pixel on these surfaces is firing a certain number of GI rays, which is set in the global illumination properties, so in this case it's 2048. So each one of these pixels here is going to be firing 2048 rays in a hemisphere out into the scene, but only a small number of those rays are going to find these very small but very bright light sources. The rest of the rays are going to come back with much dimmer results, and this is why we get this very noisy result. And the only solution in terms of pure GI is simply to fire more rays so that we get better sampling, but more rays obviously takes much longer to render. And so we find ourselves faced with a problem, because in order to get clean results with Monte Carlo, even when using hybrid mode with irradiance caching as the second bounce, render times need to increase dramatically in order to get clean results. If you look at what we had when we were using irradiance caching, the render times were pretty quick, but in order to get clean results with Monte Carlo, we're going to need to increase our render time substantially, and in many cases this simply isn't viable, so we have to look to a different solution. And the obvious solution is to use direct lights to help us with the lighting of the scene, because these are much less costly to calculate than global illumination. So what I recommend is to use direct lighting in combination with global illumination in order to get the best of both worlds. So I'm going to return to the scene, and if I open a 3D viewport, what I've done is I've parented some point lights to the luminous spheres, and I'm going to use them now to provide some of the light in the scene. I'm just going to unpause preview. You can see straight away the results are much cleaner. So in order to balance the lighting out, I'll just pause preview again. I need to go to my luminous material and just reduce the luminosity. So I'm going to bring it down to about 5 and just unpause preview and see what that does. That roughly matches what I had earlier. So I'm going to do a test render to compare it with the previous results. And with the render complete, if we compare it to the previous one, you can see that it is much cleaner. The noise has pretty much completely disappeared. It's important to notice though that the render time has also more than doubled. And the reason for this increased render time is that by adding 3 point lights to the scene, we're adding more rays, because each one of these point lights is also firing rays. And the more rays we fire, the longer our render times are going to be. It doesn't matter what source these rays come from. They could come from direct lights, they could come from global illumination, they could be reflection rays. Any rays that you add to the scene will increase render times. But the benefit of using point lights in this case is that the rays are much easier to resolve more cleanly, because direct lighting is much easier to sample than global illumination, because all the rays are being fired directly from the lights to the camera. So there isn't this case of rays being fired in random directions trying to find small light sources. So when you're using small light sources, direct lights work very well. You might need to increase the ray count to increase shadow quality, or in some cases, if you have simple shading turned off, you might need it to increase the specular highlight quality and so on and so forth. But generally, for small light sources, direct lights work very well. GI tends to come into its own more when you're using very large light sources. So what I need to do here is to balance out the ray count between the direct lights and the GI in order to get the same or similar clean results but with faster render times. So I had actually left my GI settings completely untouched when I added the point lights to the scene. So I'm going to go back to my render item to global illumination, and I'm going to reduce the indirect rays to 256, and I'm also going to reduce the irradiance rays to 128, and hopefully this will give me much faster render times without adding too much noise to the scene. So I'm just going to do a test render and find out. And here is a completed render. The good news is that my render time has gone back down to 44 seconds from just over 5 minutes. The bad news is that I was a little bit too aggressive with my ray count reduction. So I'm going to return to the scene, go back to the indirect rays, and I'm just going to multiply this value by 4 to give me 1024 rays and do another test render. And here is the render. If I compare it with the previous one, you can see that it is visibly cleaner. If I zoom in, you can see there is some noise. It's definitely not as clean as the render that was taking 5 minutes, but this render is only taking just over 2.5 minutes. So it's going to render twice as fast, and the noise isn't really objectionable because it's a very fine grain type noise that you get from Monte Carlo, and that's much more natural looking than the big blotches you get from irradiance caching. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to render the sequence and have a look at the rendered sequence in Hero once it's done. I've got the completed rendered sequence open in Hero now, and I'm going to play it so that you can compare it with what we had before. You can see the results are pretty good. The noise isn't particularly disturbing. The very fine grain that we've got from the Monte Carlo doesn't look unpleasant. It just looks like a little bit of film grain, and we can easily filter that out if we need to. If I compare it with the original render with the blotchy irradiance cache swimming all over the walls, you can see that the results are much better. We've doubled the render time in the process, but that's the price we have to pay in order to get a cleaner result. But one thing that might be interesting is that now that we're using direct lights in the scene, would be to compare the results between using the hybrid rendering and using irradiance caching on its own. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the IC back to first and second bouncers, and I'm going to increase the irradiance rays to 2048, and I'm going to fire off another test render of the sequence and see what it looks like. And with the sequence now rendered, I'm going to play it so we can compare it to the previous render we had before. And you can see again, the results aren't too bad. If I go through it frame by frame, you can see there's definitely a few hints of flickering on the surface of the wall, but it's actually not that much worse than what we had in the hybrid render. And it could be just down to the lights actually moving. But I think if we look closely at these areas around here on the floor, there is a sense that the irradiance cache is flickering quite a bit. But once we play it, it's not really that objectionable. And it's interesting to compare the render times, because this render completed in 23 minutes, whereas the hybrid render took 45 minutes. So using hybrid with Monte Carlo and irradiance caching together is considerably slower than using irradiance caching alone. It's probably a little bit more stable, and it's also probably a little bit more predictable, because my main concern when using irradiance caching in animations is just the sheer unpredictability of what you're going to get. You never know whether you're going to get flickering or not, because it's very much scene dependent, and there's often cases where you can get away with using irradiance caching in animations if there's a lot of samples, but the thing is you're never really going to know until the sequence is rendered whether you're going to run into problems. Whereas when you're using hybrid, you're less likely to run into problems, and when you're using Monte Carlo alone, it's much easier to test because you can see the level of noise that you're going to get when you render a still. And if you can get an acceptable still, you're more than likely to be able to get pretty good results with animation with a lot less unpredictability than when you're using irradiance caching. So the upshot is you can use irradiance caching in some cases, and when you do, your render times will certainly be considerably faster than when you're using hybrid or Monte Carlo, but you pay a penalty in terms of unpredictability of results. So it's just something to bear in mind. You do have the option, but it's just a little bit riskier than using Monte Carlo. And personally, I tend to go with Monte Carlo almost by default or hybrid, because I prefer having the reliability of being pretty sure that I'm going to get good results, because you end up wasting a lot of time if you render a sequence and then further down the line, maybe when it's gone into compositing, then someone notices problems and you have to re-render it again. As a final point of comparison, I'd like to try doing a pure Monte Carlo render, just to compare it with the renders that we're using hybrid or irradiance caching rendering. So I'm going to return to my Modo scene. Now a pure Monte Carlo render with 2 indirect bouncers is going to take a very long time to render. So I'm going to reduce the indirect bouncers to 1, and I'm also going to limit the indirect range to 5 meters. That means that once a GI ray has traveled 5 meters, it will return the environment color as its value. So that helps to speed up render times. I'm going to disable the irradiance caching, and now I'm going to do a test render of the whole sequence. And in this case, the sequence rendered in just over 32 minutes, which is still a little bit slower than the pure IC sequence, which rendered in 23 minutes, and that was using 2 bouncers, whereas here we're only using 1. But it's still faster than the hybrid render, where we're using 1 bounce of Monte Carlo and 1 bounce of irradiance caching, which came in at 45 minutes. So by cutting the number of bounces down to 1, I was able to get the render to complete in 32 minutes, which isn't too bad. And I've got the Monte Carlo sequence opened in Hero now, and I'm going to play it so you can see what it looks like. So you can see that the grain, although there, is pretty subtle and it's not causing too much of a problem. Now, just out of interest, I'm going to compare it with the pure IC render that I did earlier, which I've placed in the B slot here. And if I press tilde, I can maximize my screen. And what I'll do is I'll stack the two together. So on the left-hand side, I've got the Monte Carlo render. And on the right-hand side, I've got the irradiance caching render. If I now play both sequences at the same time, you can see that if you look very closely on the right-hand side, there is a little bit of flickering going on, especially in this corner, that we don't get here, because Monte Carlo is much more stable with animations. So although the grain will move around a little bit, you don't get flickering across surfaces. Whereas in this far corner here, we've got almost banding-like artifacts as the balls move down. But it is pretty subtle, and I think if we were to add motion blur and everything moving, it's probably subtle enough that you could get away with using irradiance caching in this situation. But as a general rule, Monte Carlo is much safer, which is why I tend to stick with it in most cases. If you are going to use irradiance caching, it's worth trying to use as many IC samples as you can possibly afford. The more samples, the more stable your results are going to be. And it's also worth spending a little bit of time fine-tuning your IC rate and your IC ratio to get the best, most stable results. I tend to go with a low rate and a highish ratio. So the settings I've used here was a rate of 1 and a ratio of 6, which seems to work pretty well in this case. Finally, it's worth just reminding you that in order to get decent render times with my pure Monte Carlo render, I had to make a couple of compromises. The first one is that I limited the number of indirect bounces to just 1, and then I also limited the indirect range to 5 meters. Now normally when you reduce the number of indirect bounces, your image gets darker, but this isn't the case here, and that's because I also limited the indirect range. So once my rays have traveled 5 meters, they pick up the environment color, which is why in this case, the render is actually slightly lighter than the one that doesn't have the limit on the indirect distance. So you can see that you can use these techniques in order to optimize your render times, and these are things that I'll be using in the actual production scenes later on.